Well, I'm happy to say I'm with two former Rhodesian soldiers, Paul Allin and Barry Zworestine. Barry, I spoke to some time ago. Both uh, Barry and Paul have taken a lot of time out to try and grapple with the issue of post-traumatic stress. And it is a problem that troubles people all over the world, and no easy answers from what I can see. But and that's where I think Barry and Paul have got some very useful information and ideas to contribute to trying to deal with this problem. So, Paul, I know you've written a book. Just tell us a little bit about the book, and then maybe just give us an overview of your advice to people suffering from this malaise.
Yeah, thanks, Hannes. I wrote this book, which is called A Guide to Mentally Managing Illness. And it wasn't just about uh, post-traumatic stress. It was all about how to use non-medication methods of managing many illnesses that we encounter, including things like anxiety, depression, insomnia. I included weight loss, grief, relationship issues are all covered in this book. But it was originally 300 pages long, and we condensed it down into 100 pages. That's why we called it the guide. And it's written very, very simply with a lot of key summary statements at the end of each chapter. And I'll go
Mhm.
through a few things with it. When we were talking earlier, we mentioned how a lot of Rhodesians who had been in the military, when the war ended, their life just was so disrupted. Many had to leave the country. They lost their friends. They lost their teamwork. They often had economic distress because they had to find another job. And yet it's amazed me all through this, despite the fact that many of these guys were in a lot of combat and for prolonged periods, how resilient Rhodesians have been. But we know that there are other people out there who have struggled with the changes that happen and have been experienced post-traumatic stress and what we call combat stress, which is really the effects of military on you after your military life. Whether you struggle with relationships, whether you struggle with hypervigilance, whether you don't sleep well, whether you get flashbacks, nightmares, some people get aggressive easily. There's a whole lot of things that actually show that you're experiencing that. Depression can rear its ugly head. And we'll go through a few things where we can maybe explore what you can do to try and manage it if you are experiencing those things. We're quite aware that a lot of the people that we're talking to are going to be a bit older, have probably been set in the ways that they use to deal with their problems and have some sort of coping skill that they've used for many years. So we're not trying to really change that. We're trying to make sure that people who aren't really doing well learn that there are ways to actually tackle the problem. So the first thing I'd really like to explore is a healthy lifestyle. There was a professor at Wits Medical School called Harry Seftel in the old days, and he used to talk on 702 radio in Joburg, and so he was a cardiologist, and so he was talking particularly about cardiology when he was saying this, and he said he felt that the South African lifestyle was a death style, and that was to do with basically things like the amount of stress in our lives, the lack of exercise, the amount of people who are overweight, people who smoked, people who drank excessively, all those sort of things which are not really healthy lifestyle features. If you look at a healthy lifestyle, you really need to have a preservative-free, pesticide-free diet. You should avoid recreational drugs, excessive alcohol, excessive caffeine. You should try and make sure that you sleep well. You must exercise regularly, and you must have regular exposures to what we call green space, which is basically bushwalking, walking in the countryside, being out in fields and in the open, and regular exposure to blue space, which is basically streams, lakes, dams, or the ocean. And these are for your recreational things like hobbies, exercise, and so forth. They're all part of a healthy lifestyle. And I also think that you've got to maintain a routine in your activities, and routine is really important. We'll probably come back to routine.
Barry, if I could just jump in there, because
Yeah,
what
sure.
the point you make, I think is a good one. And I get the impression there's too quick a tendency amongst people who believe they're suffering from this sort of disorder to reach for medication, and looking for a quick way out. But really, what this problem requires is an effort from the sufferer himself or herself to actually deal with it. And medication is not really the best option.
I think
Well,
medication has its place, though. I'd just like to say this right up front. There are people who definitely need medication, and especially for depression and for people who suffer a lot of disordered thinking and who really struggle. And so, I would not encourage anyone to stop medication if they're on it. It often can help you cope. But what I would like to say is that if you look at medication in the grand scale of things, it's probably 20% of the game. There's still 80% that you still need to do, even if you're on medication. And I think that's really the big take-home message. You shouldn't just rely on medication alone to help you get better and stay grounded.
Barry, have you got something to add?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, to any Rhodesians who are going to be listening to this, the first thing I really want to say is a tribute to who we are as a people. We are highly resilient, and we've actually demonstrated to the world that there's no direct link necessarily between combat and severe post-traumatic stress. We know that because many of us have got on with our lives. We've raised families, we've held jobs, and even though we've struggled, we've done extraordinarily well. So there's something about us as a population, even in our middle ages, from, we're now late 60s to late 70s, is a tribute to who we are. I worked with veterans in the past. I spent 22 years in Australia working with the military. And I remember I had a guy come in, maybe 25, and I said to him, "What's the problem?" And he said, "Man, I got really bad trauma." And I said, "Well, what did you see?" And he said, "I used to see the troppers dropping the dead bodies in Afghanistan from a net 200 meters away." And in my head, I'm going, and so? And I realized that we are dealing with maybe a population in this age that lack the resilience. We grew up in a country at war. Our fathers were patrolling the neighborhoods. Now, if we acknowledge that we've demonstrated resilience, most of us are in our 70s now. The challenge is, what is not working in your life? We need to ground this and get very practical about where are we. What is your mood like? As Paul said, what's your sleeping like? What's your relationship like? I certainly went through 2 marriages, 5 immigrations, and tried to find my peace running ultramarathons. I was running literally, but I wasn't actually starting to think about what I was carrying. Now, if we can acknowledge that, maybe we put on weight, maybe we're drinking a bit too much, maybe our well-being has started to drop, and I think Paul has a lot of valuable things to add about well-being. If we start to look at that, because there's a triangle that I work with another guy in the States, and the top of the triangle is faith. And I know that we were trying to bring on a couple of blokes who got a strong faith, and everybody has a choice about what faith they want. But we know faith is a protective factor. The bottom left is well-being, and I think, Paul, if you're really well equipped to deal with that, you're doing huge amounts. And the bottom right is tribe. I believe that with a population like ours and our age, unless somebody has significant issues, like they are so disrepaired, they are almost homeless. And there have been a couple of the Rhodesians I've supported over the years who are kind of just living in a shack in the bush, zero money, and in terrible conditions. But if we look at the majority, if we start to look at the basic tenets of well-being and belonging, and I mean, there are numbers of tribes where people belong and find a purpose. If we also start to reframe what is the knowledge we are already trained in that we can use to effect change in our present. Because it's not about teaching ourselves anything new, it's about remembering who we were. Now, as Paul and Hannes, you've seen before, it's like we learn to clean a weapon. You don't clean a weapon, you get a dirty barrel. You don't clean your barrel, you're going to get a stoppage, an AD, or a runaway gun. Now, a stoppage is like depression and anxiety. A runaway gun is you are out of control. And an AD is like those irritable bouts that keep coming out. So the challenge is, what is each guy willing to do to keep the barrel of his weapon clean? We know if we don't take care of ourselves every day, something's going to go down. Or what we're struggling with, whether it's a relationship issue or our weight or our health. And our health is starting to be impacted on. Our testosterone is dropping. And Paul, maybe you can talk to that and your thoughts to that. But I really start to work with the guys within the first session. It might be make your bed, go for a walk around the block, think about your eating. If your mood is really bad, just go see a doctor. There is a place for medication, but medication without lifestyle balance is not going to work. Cleaning the working parts of a weapon, start doing some exercise. I've exercised all my life. It is 7 days a week continuously. I know the impacts of it. So for the Rhodesians that are listening to this, there is a way to create change. You may not want to see a psychologist. We are a generation that don't do vulnerability very well. And most of us, and that includes myself, are not too quick to run off to a psychologist to start talking about what happened 47 years ago. But there are things within our daily living that we can begin to do to make improvements. And I always say, as soon as we start doing those small things, it's like going from the back of a vehicle, like a back of a 4.5 with no driver, to the front of the 4.5. And when you're in the front, you're still going through a bit of a shitstorm, but at least you're driving the vehicle.
Sorry, interesting what you say about faith, because as you guys know, I wanted Andre Schippers to join us today. And I mean, Andre probably saw, I mean, he was wounded 13 times. So if anybody was traumatized by combat, it was Andre. But he fobbed this off because he says, I don't need this. I've got my faith. I'm not suffering. I've got my Christian faith and it's rock solid. And so I don't actually have a lot to contribute to dealing with this problem.
What was interesting, Hannes, is having that discussion and speaking to Andre about it was that he doesn't realize that his faith saved him. He probably does realize it, but he said, I don't have post-traumatic stress. Don't know what it is. I don't know what experience. So I can't add to this, but I felt that his faith actually saved him. There was a guy that you'd expect to have been really messed up by what happened to him, and he isn't at all. He's loving his life, and he's very busy living with his family and carrying on now. And he has a massive faith. So I think we cannot underestimate the role that plays. And that doesn't matter. You don't have to be ultra religious or whatever. But I think it's the fact that you have a belief in a being it's more superior to us, because religion is very personal, and I think people do religion differently. But a lot of people I've come across who've been really struggling have dealt with it through their faith. I want to add a concept here, which would maybe we could flow on from this. And this is what I call a concept that I invented, which I call brain dialysis. And brain dialysis is like kidney dialysis. When you've got toxins in your body and your kidney clears them, and if you've got kidney failure, you end up being poisoned. So I think the same thing happens with our mental health. We have to have brain dialysis. We have to do things with our mental health to stay grounded and to make sure that we don't, to maintain our mental health, as well as treat ourselves if we actually get any mental illnesses. And brain dialysis just consists of the things that we have to do to stay free of mental illness. It's really self-belief, which Rhodesians are really good at, the self-discipline, which I think most military people have, learning from your mistakes and not just regretting things, and really just moving on and realizing that mistakes are a positive thing. Learning how to deal with anger. It's often just better to hold your tongue and not say anything, and you'll feel better about it afterwards. Anger management is really important. I think change management is also important. People find it very difficult to change behaviors. Meditation, prayer, mindfulness, and looking after relationships, they're all part of brain dialysis.
Well, I was just another thing we should throw in here. I've got interested in the Vikings, and I've been reading quite a bit about them. And interesting what a big part in their whole sort of fighting ethos, humor played. They were very good at finding the funny side, no matter how dire the situation. And that actually reminded me a lot of the Rhodesian way, which has always been to try and find the funny side, no matter how bad the situation is. And I think that almost unique characteristic that was so prevalent amongst Rhodesians, and particularly fighting Rhodesians, was that wonderful ability to keep laughing, no matter how desperate the situation was. And I think that ability has helped a lot of guys through
Correct.
through the trauma.
And Hannes, we also have a strong identity. Even though our country doesn't exist, we still have a very strong identity.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it lives in cyberspace, we are who we are and we're proud of who we are. And that identity is also a critical protective factor. Paul, you mentioned, I think, something which I believe in a lot is, you talked about the well-being and the disciplines that go through it. Well, for me, any change, it doesn't matter what you want to do. You want to get fit, you want to lose weight. It's all about approaching discomfort. Now, Rhodesians are masters of dealing with discomfort. The Rhodesian War was one of the most uncomfortable wars in many ways. Even just, 4 people in the bush or the scouts or the RLI, it was a tough war. So that is still wired into us. Age tends to weaken aspects of that. But the one thing we know we can do is no matter what our age is, no matter whether we put on weight, no matter if our nutrition is not that great, if we choose to change, there are incremental things that you can do. Maybe eat less, start walking around the block, some basic stretches, little things like that, swimming, finding leisure pursuits that give you pleasure. Those little things start to create change, but you have to be willing to work through some discomfort and resistance to change. Now, I think with a lot of the Rhodesians I've spoken to over the years, it's like, bugger it. I am where I am now, and that's just, I'll live with it till I die. Well, absolutely. You can live with aspects of not wanting to go right into your ambush zone and deal with the major stuff that happened. But if you want to improve your well-being, if you want to manage your health, see someone like Paul and look at aspects of your health, there are options to do that. And I've often found when we start managing our well-being and we're more in control and we've got a discipline every day, it's interesting to see what's left outside of what we call trauma. Sometimes it tends to evaporate quite a lot. The other thing is, I like acronyms as well. And I came up with something called PMTC, which is Post-Military Transitioning Challenges. Now, we lost our country. We lost the war. We were betrayed. There's a moral injury. Losing our country was a moral injury. We immigrated sometimes many times. We often all in a generation where we still have to work bloody hard to make a living. There's no such thing as retirement for many of us. Some have struggled financially. We're aging, and we still have to work hard and be hard. So though all that kind of stuff can kick up poor sleep, at some age and maybe hormonal stuff that happens, some stress because of finances, relationships falling apart, health falling apart. You go to a doctor and give him all those symptoms, and he goes, "What's your history?" And you go, "I was in the war." And he goes, "You seem to have trauma." Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe what you've got are the impacts of transitioning over 47 years. It's like, I remember when I was running comrades at about 60 Ks, I got injured. Now, I was anxious. My mood dropped because I'd invested months of training. I didn't want to be there. I felt useless. I was getting really stressed about it. Is that trauma? No, it's a transitional challenge. And so when we realize that you can have all these things, but it doesn't mean one, you're disordered, and two, you have trauma. So when we normalize, we also give ourselves an opportunity to realize, I'm okay, but there are things I can do to improve.
Yeah, Barry, I was just thinking what you say about us aging, and I'm seeing more and more the impact of what happened all that time ago is really making itself felt more and more with age. But
Huge.
when you think of the life of the combat soldier, there's a bit of a paradox because when you're dealing with the likelihood of sudden death, in an inverse way, that's a reason to stop worrying about things because death can come calling at any time, and
Totally.
in that process, you also, it fosters the most intense friendships, as we all know, because of the situation you're in, and the only way you're going to survive is by sticking together. And so, this is where this very strong brotherhood comes together. And so, that's a mind-changing, life-changing experience, which I think we all went through up to one point or another. And you then conditioned to that. And in a way, in a funny way, it's almost a comfortable place to be because there's no point in planning for the future because you might die this afternoon. So forget about that. Just live for the day. And then suddenly that situation ends. and now you
Yeah.
take your kit bag and you're out on the street, and now what? You've got to start thinking for yourself, and there's nobody out there to kill you, but what are you gonna do next? And for some chaps, they never made that transition effectively, and
No.
some muddled through for a while, and I saw a lot of guys just take to the booze and basically drink themselves to death. They just never really managed to come to terms with a different lifestyle. And I see, I'm still dealing with quite a few good friends who are in having a tough time at the moment, and it's really part of that whole process. They never really managed to affect the change
No.
and get themselves on a steady path forward.
And some are unfortunately lost, hey, Hannes. And this is
Mm.
the tragedy: is that there are that area of guys, for all the experiences they had, the things they saw, and the lives that followed, who are lost, and they really struggle intensely. And some of the things I'm talking about for those guys, really guys like Paul, where they can look more holistically. As Paul said, when your mood is right down by your feet, hey, there's nothing wrong in having an appropriate bit of medication to sort you out and give you some sleep, because it's all very well telling guys to start looking at their well-being. But when they're in this deep place, dark place, you don't want to do anything. And I know a lot of the guys on the groups I'm in the States, they talk about the sense of sitting alone in a unit with a weapon by their side or the muzzle in their mouth, because they're just in such a dark place. Now, you can't talk somebody out of that place. But when you belong to a tribe and people are actually checking in on each other, it's one thing. When somebody can tell some guy, look, I will come with you and we're going to talk to a doc. So you can actually talk to him about what's happening and I will help you. The other thing is our relationships can really blow out because we don't talk. None of us talk much. We're terrible. And I'm like that. And I've virtually seen every bloke I've sat with is like that. And so in the book I wrote a kind of template letter from a veteran to a partner. And it means all the guy has to do is modify it and go, here, read this, and then I'm ready for a discussion. Because it's hell of a hard to start to talk about one thing, which is the most painful thing for all of us as men, is our grief. I'm telling you, Hannes, what I learned, and Paul, I don't know what your thoughts are. When we strip away the war, the stories, our moves, our divorces, and all the stresses we've had, at the bottom of it all, the thing that binds every veteran together is the collective experience of grief. And none of us like going near grief. We hate it. But I often say with grief,
grief, Mary, just to say it, is grief we grieve because we cared.
absolutely.
And I think that was one of the things with the Rhodesians. We cared. We cared about our country. We cared about our countrymen.
Yeah.
And that's why we have grief. And if you have lost a soulmate or a friend and you're grieving, it's just a sign that you cared.
It is, Paul.
So there's no
and the thing with
surprise in
grief,
my mind.
what I say,
it's what you say is so right, Paul. And I say it to my wife on occasion, because she gets a bit irritated with me at times, because I get very down about things, but it's exactly that. And I say, I wish I didn't care as much as I do, but that's just the way we are. It would be a release if these things didn't impact on us the way they do. Life would be a lot simpler, but that's just our makeup. I don't know why or how it happened, but that's certainly what the cut that the cloth that we cut from.
Sorry, just a bit on relationships, and we said that we struggle a little with them. I think working on relationships is absolutely key in maintaining your well-being, because when you have anxiety or you're stressed, having someone who loves you and you talk to is actually they can keep you grounded, and they can be a real big leveler and stop you going off on a tangent. And I think that, to me, relationship management is an absolute key component of all of this. We have to look after our relationships, and often it means, as I said earlier, keeping your mouth shut when when you know that you're probably going to stir something up. I mean, I rather say nothing sometimes, then you can actually avert an argument or a negative discussion. And if you're going to criticize constructively, or criticize or just say positive things. We can keep our mouths shut. And if you learn to do that, you're actually often a lot more proud of yourself than if you had flown off the handle and been aggressive or angry. So there's a lot of little tricks that you can learn, and they're not simple. You've got to actually practice them and think about them when you do them.
Well, I tell the guys in your relationship with your partner, you got to work out how to go from your ambush zone to your OP. Because in the ambush zone, you're just shooting your mouth off, eh? And zero outcome there. It's just a 360-degree cluster at that point. And it's how you go OP to get some distance. And in my book, actually, I think I wrote, there's 12 strategies for managing relationships from an operational point of view. But it works. It actually works. And I think, I find most of us, I don't know how many people have been through divorces. I cranked up too. So, and I'm reasonably sane, I think. But, 2 divorces is quite a lot. And I realized that I hadn't learned the skills. And because we trigger edged, it's very easy for people to become the enemy. And what I've learned with all of us, and not just the Rhodesians, but every veteran I've sat with, is we are incredibly loyal. We're willing to put our lives on the line for others. We have the most impeccable set of values that are short supplied in civilian life. But boy, when we crank up, we can really crank up. We can come out of the starting blocks hard and fast. And that's why I think it's quite important to teach the guys, basic pull-throughs. What I did with a lot of the guys is, especially with some of the SAS boys, is the cold shower stuff. Like cold showers are, chase discomfort because it also kicks down the back of the brain quickly. And I tell a guy, when you're about to blow your mouth off, you make an agreement with your wife that when you're about to sort of hang in your ambush zone and you're going to create some serious damage, tell her you're going to take a 15-minute timeout. You go and do your breathing, and there's specific breathing techniques. If that doesn't work, climb into a cold shower for 30 seconds, then come out, then go back in. And it's teaching basically operational protocols and emergency protocols that can ground you back in your body. Because we can take control, and we have to take control.
Yeah, or go for a walk. That's the other thing that sometimes, you can walk off stuff. And I'm a great fan of this using the exercise. We've talked about it earlier, but the exercise is one of those things that you need to do it. I think you need to make sure it's part of your routine so that you don't think of it as something that you specially do. It has to be part of your life. It has to be your way of life. And if you do go for, a lot of us maybe have got arthritis or whatever, but there's something you can do. You can do lots of stuff. Like if you've got bad arthritis, you can do Tai Chi, you can do yoga, you can do all that sort of stuff. If you haven't got arthritis, you can go for a bike ride, you can go for a walk in the bush. All those sort of things get the motion out of you. And not only that, you ruminate and think about nice things when you're walking. That's what I do anyway. I actually sometimes also plug in those earpods and listen to music because it's just fantastic to do. So encourage people that these aren't things that are hard, but if you don't make a routine of it, you're not going to do it.
Barry, you mentioned.
I tell the guys, sorry, carry on.
No, you mentioned moral injury.
Yeah.
And I think that's another significant factor. The fact
Big
that
time.
the whole thing ended so unsatisfactorily.
The
fact that I often think it might have been better if we'd been beaten militarily, because then you just take your lumps. You lost. But everybody walked away with feeling very badly let down, because military we performed exceptionally well and punched way above our weight for our numbers.
Correct.
And yet suddenly the carpet was pulled from under our feet, and there was no denouement, nothing, no end really. It was just goodbye. Thanks. Not even thanks for coming. It's just you're on your own.
Yeah.
It's over.
And that moral injury, Hannes, is the anger that still lies within us because we were betrayed and betrayed and betrayed. And as a result of the betrayal, how do we see the deaths of all our mates who never made it, who are lost and gone? And there's nothing to give us meaning within that. And then our lives that followed as we blasted out. And the problem was in the 70s, nothing was known about PTS or trauma or combat stress. I mean, I left 3 in-depth, and I think 2 weeks later, I was at university waking up 20 times a night. I didn't even know there was anything wrong with me. I have a picture of my student card when I arrived, and it's just got my eyes are almost crossed, but I had no awareness at all. And I mean, I was not like the RLI or the SA was disgusting border pursuits and dropping in. You know, Hundy and Cashel were busy, but nothing like other guys. But the sustained hypervigilance over long periods of time to
Mm,
sustain combat, it changed us and it rewired our brain. The
mm,
other thing as well I see is that I think under sustained conditions of stress and uncertainty, we damp down our emotional cycle.
mm,
And there's a positive to it in that I find most veterans and the Rhodesians I know, the resilience we describe is because we are able to sustain huge amounts of stress and still stay coherent. The challenge, though, is in our relationships, we look like we don't feel, but we
mm,
do, but we
mm,
feel deeply. And
mm,
I think it's how we navigate through that and start to share conversations. But you know, you can't just drag the words out of yourselves. We are not at an age or a generation who find it easy to talk. And we need to respect that and see what are the options and who can guide us into these conversations. And, you know, I think, again, the tribe that you've talked about, what would it look like if we watched each other six, if we kept an eye on each other, checked in, hey, what's happening? How are you going? Because men to men, we can get to that, even at our
mm.
age. You know, on some of the groups I'm on, we're all around some of the Vietnam boys. We're all in our 70s and 80s, but we can start to say, hey, I'm not doing well. And being placed in tribe is an opportunity to share something to some extent that can allow you, one, to feel heard, and two, to be guided into change. So, you know, I guess we can do it better. We're not too old. It doesn't have to be complex, but it can be done. But you have to have the will to want to change at the smallest level. You have to have the will and desire.
One of the things I sort of mentioned about that was that how little things matter, and if you making this desire to change, the changes you have to make don't have to be massive. They're often small incremental changes, and you can do lots of little things. And a bit later, I'll talk a little bit about some of the strategies to manage anxiety disorders and stress. And they are a lot of the things that you can do there may not work for different people, but if you don't try them, you won't know. And actually, a lot of them may have a small role, but you don't really realize they are playing a role. And that's these little things all add up, and eventually you come out of the problem that you have.
You know, Barry, what you were alluding to about not talking, I get
Yeah.
I get it in the neck from my children and particularly the children about the reunions. Because I'm always off to some damn reunion, or not always, but lots of reunions. And I know, Paul, you're about to go to one of yours. But you know, I think it's because that is the one occasion where uh, we can talk because we're
And we
with people
belong.
who, and you know, unfortunately, what happened to us, we bombshelled all over the world. So you know, these reunions take on a very special uh, complexion, certainly for me and most of the people that went through what we went through. But it is that release where you
It
are
is.
actually able to just offload. And I suppose we all take comfort from being with our friends who are also dealing with some of the same problems. Because for people who don't come from our background, it's very difficult for them to understand what what we're dealing with. And I don't like to sound like a crybaby, you know, that we're all bloody depressed and despondent and life's too tough. But we do have special memories and special issues that are pertinent really to only to our lot. So only time you really get to get stuff off your chest is when you're with the people that that you went through this with.
Well, you know, Hannes, the funny contradiction is when you're back in tribe, you don't really need to talk because everybody understands. That
Yeah,
which we
yeah.
can't talk about when we look in each other's eyes is we understand each other. We understand our grief, we
Mm,
understand our pain, and we understand our loss. And the very fact of being in tribe is already profoundly healing because you belong. It's
hmm
like the marches in
hmm
Australia on Anzac. For that brief moment, that warrior part of ourselves becomes visible and we
hmm
can affirm. And I often say to the guys, I say to guys, like, would you leave a bloke behind? And they go, nope. So I go, so how come you left yourself behind? Now they start to understand it. And then I'll say to them, so we've got a mission here, and we're going to have to work out some SOPs to kind of transition back to where we were and identify the challenges that we carry. And then we also have to identify the strengths that we have, and we need to bring it back into our current place. And it's that mission to go and rescue yourself. And it is a rescue mission. And when guys get it, they're quite prepared to make themselves their new mission of rescuing, because they can begin to see the benefits, and it doesn't have to be complex. But there's one thing, Hannes, that I've also tracked, hey, and I tracked it in myself. And I hadn't realized for many years that this existed. On an Anzac March, a number of the RLI were there, and there were a couple of scouts and a few SAS. And I remember looking at them and went, well, I wasn't jumping out of choppers and I wasn't doing cross-border stuff. And I felt like I didn't belong. And I felt that I didn't have the right to call myself a veteran. And that sense of the imposter syndrome was really haunting. And as I sat and I talked to the guys, it's that thing which we don't like talking about, not feeling good enough. And I've got a mate who's a Navy SEAL, actually born in South Africa. And I said to him, do you have this? And he said, yeah. He said, I have it because I didn't feel I went on as many operations as the other SEALs went. So I realized that it's everywhere, but it's the thing we are most uncomfortable about acknowledging. But when we realize most of us don't feel good enough, most of us can be a little bit uncomfortable about putting whatever medals we got on our chest on because we don't feel we've earned the right. But, a Rhodesian officer, a guy from 3INDIP, he said once to me, the minute you put on uniform and put your feet into operations or whatever you did in the war, you earn the right. We're all the same. It's just the territories that differed. And I remember that sense of, letting go of that imposter stuff, which can really haunt guys and kick down mood and really have profound impact. So I think for anybody listening to this, if you were in the Rhodesian Bush War at whatever level, it doesn't matter. The stories were all different, but everybody earns the right to stand strong and stand tall within themselves.
Without a doubt. I couldn't agree with you more.
Okay, I thought I might just talk a little bit about some points in managing stress and anxiety here, Hannes, if that we can edit whatever.
Please do.
These are the points that I believe in managing stress, and it's so stress and anxiety are very similar. And so when we talk about post-traumatic stress, it's an anxiety condition, and you can get all kinds of things with post-traumatic stress, like we mentioned earlier, but things like just heightened vigilance, feeling anxious, not sleeping well, even having panic attacks, nightmares. They're all, an anxiety state. Now, the key with anxiety is, first of all, I think it's a normal thing when you use it, when it's in low levels, because it actually improves your performance. The same with stress. So being worried about an exam or whatever will improve your performance, but there becomes a time when you have too much of it and you go over that edge where it no longer becomes beneficial and you can be burnt out, or you start developing dysfunction. And when you get the dysfunction, that's the warning sign. So you need to start doing something about it when you start becoming dysfunctional with anxiety or stress. The things aren't, some of these things are so obvious, but first of all, you need to if something's worrying you, take a helicopter view of it and say, what can I fix here? And what can't I fix? And try and put things into baskets and ignore the things that you can't fix. They have a way of working out. If you can't do anything about it, why worry about it? You're just wasting your emotional reserves. So that's the first point. The second point is then manage the things that you can manage and make a plan to get in control of them, because the minute you have control, you start feeling that everything's okay. So it's those two simple things with things that are bothering you. And there are a couple of other little things that I like to mention. First of all is keeping a balance in your life. So often we see people mess up their priorities. And, I always believe that, I often ask patients this. I say, so what's your most important priority? And quite often people are, they're mentally distressed about something. And they always say, oh, I'm worried about my daughter. And I say, no, what's your most important priority in life? And it actually is yourself. You need to actually take care of yourself as your first priority in life, because if you're no good to anybody. So, I qualify that in saying that you must do it in a selfless way and not a selfish way. So it mustn't be at the expense of anyone else. And if you do that, you're actually going to make sure that you stay well. The second priority, obviously, is your family and your loved ones. And the third priority is your work or hobbies or other stuff like recreation or whatever. So people mess up priorities. And so often I can see it quite easily. I'll say, you've got your priorities all wrong. You're taking work home and all you're thinking about is work all the time. Stop that. You just look after yourself first. The second thing is work on managing insomnia. I'll talk a bit about insomnia later, but people who are anxious don't sleep well, and they have their things running around in their heads. So you have to actually start working on insomnia. The other thing is avoiding excessive alcohol and caffeine. They all exacerbate anxiety and depression. And the same thing with recreational drugs. Recreational drugs, everyone thinks, oh, they're okay, but they exacerbate anxiety. They all do. There's not one that doesn't. And the other thing that Barry mentioned earlier was about the front brain, hind brain thing, or conscious brain versus subconscious brain. You've got to try and learn to keep your front brain in charge. And there's a lot of different techniques that we can use to do that. That's to keep the conscious brain going. He's mentioned the cold shower therapy. I love that. There's the breathing techniques. There's the meditation. There's a few other things, mindfulness. They're all part of that. And lastly, it's about avoiding non-helpful behaviors and thinking. So you've got to that's such a I know it's a global statement, but you've got to try and judge your thoughts, judge your thinking, and say, are these useful thoughts? Are they negative thoughts? And try and get rid of the unhelpful thoughts, put them in a basket and say, I don't need that. Because one thing we can control in our minds is our thoughts. You can't control emotions, but you can control thoughts. You can discard thoughts. And that's the same thing when people have suicidal ideation. They might be thinking negatively about themselves and saying, well, I don't, nobody loves me. I don't want to be in this life. But that's a thought. You can discard that thought. And I think that's a really important point to make, that you don't have to act on thoughts. You can get rid of them. So if people are having distressing thoughts, you can actually throw them away and not actually pay attention to them. It's not easy, but it can be done.
Paul's got a whole range. Now, what I would do is, let's say I sent a bloke to see Paul. So he'd come back and Paul and I would talk and we'd identify a couple of things that the guy is willing to do. So the guy would have maybe 15 minutes worth of pull-throughs that he's prepared to commit to every single day. It's his choice. If he's not motivated to do it, so be it. When you're ready, let me know. Once he's committed, what I do is I want to replicate I don't want to replicate the classical clinical scenario where I'll see you in 2 weeks. What I do is each day when you do something that works, you text me on WhatsApp. So that means I've got your back and I'm walking with you. So we replicate tribe. There's also accountability. So he doesn't feel alone, and there's reward when a thumbs up. And a lot of Rhodesians, Hannes, over the years, there was one guy living in a caravan and he had quite a lot of trauma. And all I did was I worked with breathing techniques, tapping techniques, using acupressure points, and just keeping touch with him. And I tell you, it took maybe a couple of months, and the guy was in a really good space from a distance. I know that the most important thing is how we have each other's backs. You don't need a psych to do what I do. What happens when you've got a mate and the mate says, look, there's going to be some shared accountability here. I'll tell you when I do stuff, you tell me, and we keep each other accountable. And I learned the value of this when I was training for comrades. It's like I would not have run comrades on my own. So I had a bloke who trained me for 6 months. He held me accountable when I didn't want to do something. He told me that when I used to say, no, I'm really sore, he'd say, you made a commitment to me, you keep doing it. And I often say this to the guys. They go, oh, it's too cold to have a cold shower. I said, discomfort's not going to kill you. I don't feel like a walk. Well, the time you don't feel like a walk is the best time to go for a walk, because if you achieve something without resistance, there's not much learning. Achieving something with resistance, when you still get up and do it, is when you really strengthen and grow and have a sense of achievement. So the way we can help each other is by creating that peer support network in our tribes, where guys start to check on each other, where maybe they've got some professional help, or they themselves have identified some of the tools they want to use for their well-being, and then folk check on each other. Let me know, text me, WhatsApp me. Let's keep each other accountable, because it's very difficult to do this journey on your own. And some guys are not in relationships. And, as Paul said, we've got injuries. I mean, I have discs in my neck, blown discs in my back, knee replacements and pins in my shoulder. But, when I get down on the floor, it's hard getting back up. but every morning it's a discipline. I get down for like 40 minutes. I've got all my stuff 7 days a week nonstop. It's how we help people
Oh, you've
to
got to
go
make
back to who they used to be.
you,
So
you've
say
got
again?
you've got to make the effort. It's not just going to
You've
come to
got,
you.
and this
It's the
is it,
bottom line.
Hannes. So the core thing is people can listen to this talk, but when you are willing to make an effort, you
Mm,
are ready for the change that you can make. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It's the
mm,
small incremental things that you are willing to do and face your resistance into not wanting to do it because maybe you've put on weight and walking is uncomfortable. Okay. So are you willing to embrace some discomfort for a 10-meter walk, a 50-meter walk, around the block? Are you willing to do that? If you're not, then you make a choice. And then, we can be there for somebody, but they're making a choice. If the choice is driven by significant trauma and they're not capable of making a choice, then guys like Paul are the next critical step. Are you willing to see a doc? If they go, nope, well, you tried.
Another
Yeah, I think
factor that we haven't really touched on is this whole adrenaline story.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all been through it. That adrenaline rush. There's nothing like combat where you're now fighting for life itself, and when you survive, there's a tremendous high, and I do think that can become mildly addictive, and that's where some soldiers go to another level because they're desperate for more of that
Yeah.
adrenaline
And they're
rush.
parachuting. We know some of the guys are still parachuting. I mean,
Yeah.
Hannes, I was at 65. I was heading off into the bush where we live and running in 42 degrees heat at 65, which was ridiculous. And what I did eventually was I blew my meniscus because I was chasing that wall, which I've chased
Mm-hmm.
for most of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I took myself out of the things I loved the most, which was running.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that chasing that wall and chasing the adrenal high, yes, if it's out of control, you bug it, hey? You're in big trouble if you try pushing that one.
It's funny. I was talking to I'll just call him Steve, which is his real name, and I'm not going to give his whole name in case he'd be embarrassed. But an old friend of mine, and he did, I think, 3 years in the SAS, and we were talking about this post-traumatic stress, and he said, "Fuck, post-traumatic stress. Those were the best 3 years of my life. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
that's all I wanted. If I could go back through that all again, I'd do it tomorrow. I've got no hard feelings. The only hard feelings I've got is it's all, it happened, it finished too quickly. So, so
So, Hannes, what would happen if we stopped approaching all the guys from that level? That maybe that time at war was the time that they felt the most alive, they
Mhm,
belonged to each other, they
mhm.
were brothers. What if we
Yes.
stepped away from that to look at how's your life now? What are the things that are not working and how do we create change? What if we just diffused a little bit from that stuff?
Mhm,
Because when you tell guys you got trauma from the Rhodesian Bush War, and he goes, bugger off, man, that was the best time. But what if
mhm.
we focus on the present? Where are you now? Like guys watching this, where are you now? What's working? What's not working? And what are you willing to do about that?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a tricky one, but I've got to say, thanks to you guys, I've actually learned a hell of a lot from this bit of counselling for myself. I got out of this chat.
Uh,
Very, very interesting, and I'm sure it'll be of interest to a lot of other people, not necessarily from our background, but the problems that we've discussed and issues and possible remedies, I think are pertinent to a hell of a lot of people out there.
well, we're all a bit bedonned, Hannes, and if we recognize that and just stand okay in it, we're a different generation. There is a difference. Veterans are neither better than anyone or worse than anyone,
No,
but it's a different kind of animal you're looking at.
Barry, when I look at what's happening in the modern world, and I don't want to sound like too much like an old fuddy-duddy, but I wonder if we weren't blessed in a way because
Hmm,
we dealt with adversity. So we've been probably better prepared for life, which never
spot
comes
on.
easily. When you look at all these the younger generations in England and America and stuff, there's terrific unhappiness, despite the fact that they don't really have to deal with any major adversity. I mean, I'm sure they've got to go and get a job at some stage and everything, but life might have been a bit too easy. And as a result, it doesn't seem to have made them a hell of a lot happier. When you look at what's
Yeah.
happening in England and Europe and America, these youngsters, I mean, they're all on drugs from not only recreational
Yeah.
drugs, but they're on medication for depression. I think 1/3 of America is on medication for depression. Well, what are you depressed about? Nobody's
Well, I
trying to
think it's
kill
the same
you.
thing in Oz. The thing that amazes me here is how um, that I think a lot of the young guys, when I did my national service, I was 18, and you had to toughen up and get on with it. And we were out there, and the war really hotted up in our area, within a few months of us starting NS. And when I look at some of the 18-year-olds that I come across in Australia, I think they've had such a cozy life that they haven't been able to mature. And what we're seeing is that they're maturing when they're much older. So they're sort of only maturing when they're like about 24, 25 years old or even older. And I think also the other thing that I think's been played a really negative role is social media. I mean, social media, I think, has been a bit of a scourge, to tell you the truth. It might help with communication with friends and things like that, but it creates unrealistic expectations about life. People spend their lives looking at screens, which is just something, it's a recipe for making anxiety worse. And also it's a recipe for insomnia. If you're looking at a screen just before you go to bed, you can't sleep. And all this sort of stuff I don't think has been talked about enough. And I certainly
Yeah.
encourage my kids to try and not to use it as much as their
Mhm.
friends do. Anyway, but
Yes.
I think that we were lucky in a way that I think we got thrown into that deep end, and it certainly, it's done me well. I can't complain about it. I'm still quite happy to work hard, and I've got a lot of self-discipline from it. But and I think most of us did as well. The Rhodesians all had that sort of ethic.
Mhm.
But Hannes, I think, as I said, all of us can be proud of who we are. We are a resilient, strong population of people. We've
Mhm.
done damn well with our lives.
Mhm.
We've struggled, but we've done well. And if
Mhm.
we give ourselves a pat on the back and go, one, we know there's no direct link to war always and trauma, that you can have a little bit of combat stress and transitional stuff, but that we've done well with what we experienced and the losses we did have. And the next
Mhm.
challenge in this stage of our lives is, in what ways do you want to make it a bit better? That simple question. What do you want to improve? And when you can identify that, you can work from the present into your future and create the changes. So when you breathe your last breath, it's a lighter breath. It's a healthier breath. And I think that balance between that way of seeing things, the stuff Paul is doing, we are extraordinary, man. We rewrite the books on trauma. They didn't think about us when they did all of this, because it was one of the most violent wars on this planet, and we did well. And I think we can
Mhm.
pat each other on the back and know that we are not disordered. We are not all
Mhm.
necessarily traumatized.
Mhm.
Generally, we're a healthy bunch who've struggled for understandable reasons, and that there's still a lot of room and time left to enjoy a better life.
And I think we can also take credit of the fact that although there's an inner anger, we haven't taken it out on the world. We've really tried to pick
No.
up pieces and go wherever we've gone and try to make a contribution.
Yeah.
And it's just sad that we all had to go in different directions and couldn't just stay in one place and apply ourselves to the country where we all wanted to live out our lives. I think we would have made a great success of it.
Yeah.
But our people have done extremely well all over the world and have made a hell of a positive impact just about everywhere they've been. So quite a special breed that I think we came from. It's just a pity it couldn't last.
Well, I've got two my other mates. One's a SEAL Team 6 boy and one's a SEAL Team guy. And they spoke to me about how the Rhodesians live so powerfully in their worlds, the legends of the Rhodesians. So we are still alive. We have informed a lot of American approaches to fighting wars, and we are
Mm,
held in high esteem. So,
mm.
we can stand tall, eh? Before we start pathologizing ourselves, we can stand tall.
All right, guys. Well, listen, I'm going to thank you very much indeed for your time, and I hope we can probably get together again with one of the other guys or one or two of the other guys who might want to add something to this. But very interesting, and I thank you, Paul, and thank you, Barry.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
Hannes,
thanks, Paul, for your
it's
contribution, eh? The
Yeah,
medical
sure.
stuff is so
If
important.
there's a need to get maybe a whole, like a Zoom meeting, and where we could just have random invitations, I'm quite happy to do that. And also, if we need to have another go with somebody who wants to maybe, as you say, contribute from a different angle or not a clinical angle, I'll be prepared to do that as well. So no big deal.
Great. Well, wish you guys a happy weekend, and
Yeah, cheers. Eh?
and we'll be in touch.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay, thanks.
a lot,
Thanks,
Hannes.
guys. Paul, Hannes.
Thanks,
Take care,
Barry.
guys.
Cheers,
Bye.
Thanks, boys.
Bye.